Who Trespass Against Us. The Untold Story of the Life, Death, and Judgment of the Las Vegas Shooter, and One Girl's Journey Through That Dark Night. By D.P. Conway. Narrated by Randy Hames. Inspired by actual events. Fairy tales do not tell children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed. G.K. Chesterton. Dear reader, you are about to read or perhaps listen to a story possibly unlike anything you've ever heard before. I have combined story elements into a unique work of genre-bending fiction, Book Life, October 2018, to bring you the untold story of the life, death, and final judgment of Stephen Paddock, along with a story of a fictional young woman named Theresa May and her friend Bree, both victims of the tragedy. I used real events from Paddock's life and also from the lives of his father Benny and his grandfather Mason. I have also taken historical persons, events, and places occurring or existing on or around the time of the story, and I've carefully woven them in. I also used angels, in particular a dark angel named Thaddeus in parts of the story, in order to fully explore the mystery of good and evil. This exposition shows the dark side, but also the hope that comes only from the light. As the Kirkus review of this work in October 2018 stated, Thaddeus's subplot, which further entails glimpses of the afterlife, is a surprisingly engaging examination of evil, which isn't necessarily predetermined here. There's room for free will. We have now waited over a year for law enforcement to tell us why Paddock did it. But as I suspected within days of the shooting, we'll never know. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the story as I did, in an attempt to give answers to the question, why? You are invited to go to dpconway.com and review my extensive research page called What's Real, What's Fiction, and Why. I imagine that every reader of this story will find this research to be fascinating. But forget about that for now. Just sit back and let me tell you a story. Opening Statement. I am Thaddeus. 6,000 years ago, I was an angel in the heavens, until I foolishly took part in the Great Rebellion. Now I am a dark angel, and at the time of this writing, there is little hope I will ever be anything else. There is something I need to confess to you about the events in Las Vegas on October 1st, 2017. I was Stephen Paddock's dark angel, and I admit that on that night, I was there. People don't realize it, but we are always there. I was assigned to his family line centuries ago, and I tell you truly, this event had its roots long before Stephen Paddock did his dark deed. I'm picking up the story in Dundee, Scotland, because that's where things got going. It is, as they say, the beginning of the matter. The most important thing I want you to understand is that I did the unthinkable for a dark angel. I tried to stop him, and I will say this at my trial. The real story of everything that happened is set down in these pages. Why do I say this? Because I am the only one who knows the whole story. I am the only one who was there from the start. Whether or not you believe me, that is up to you. Chapter 1. 1889, Dundee, Scotland. "No, Mrs. Marjorie, we have no other children, just wee little Mason here," Ellen Barry said in her thick Scottish accent. "Aye, he's a handsome little boy. How old is he?" asked Mrs. Marjorie. "He's only 1 month, and smart as a whip, mind you," Ellen said, as she sat in the little shop on Prince Street, cradling the infant in her arms. Mrs. Marjorie sipped her tea and glanced out the window at the cold, rainy January day. "And ye travelled all the way from Whitechapel, London, with him only being 1 month old, did ye?" "Ah, yes. We had to leave straight away. There was no time to tarry." Ellen looked up and saw her husband William in the distance. "Oh, here comes my husband now." Mrs. Marjorie turned toward the window, pausing momentarily. Something about the man rattled her, though she didn't know what. Maybe it was his eyes. They were cold and dark. They held something. An emptiness, perhaps, but one filled with hatred and evil. But then the man smiled at her, and the feeling went away as quickly as it had come. William Barry walked into the shop, located underneath the upstairs flat for rent. Ellen stood up to introduce her husband. "William, this is the landlady, Mrs. Marjorie. She says the place is still available and will cost 5 shillings a month." William put on his fake smile and nodded. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Marjorie. We will take it." Mrs. Marjorie's eyes widened a bit. "Aye, you'll take it, will ye?" She paused and clasped her hands together, thinking, then said, "From Whitechapel, you say, She paused again, trying to form the right words for her question. She then asked, "Well, what sort of work was this you Whitechapel people have been about, letting Jack the Ripper kill so many?" William Barry kept his smile fixed, but inwardly he wanted to grab her by the throat. The rage rose faster than ever. Ellen saw him reacting. She felt the tension, and placed her hand on his arm, laughing. "Well, from all I've heard, Mrs. Marjorie, Jack the Ripper is quiet now, and I have a feeling it'll stay that way." "Oh, you do you?" Mrs. Marjorie said, rolling her eyes. "Well, we'll see, I suppose." There was silence as the three stood inside the front of Mrs. Marjorie's store and flat. Ellen broke the silence. "Well, may we have the place?" Mrs. Marjorie paused for a moment, then nodded. "Aye, why, sure you can. Here's the key. I'll open a little account for ye in my store so you can get started." "That won't be necessary," said William, as he briskly turned toward the door, leaving Mrs. Marjorie to hand the keys to Ellen. 3 weeks later. Ellen glanced over at the fireplace where William was sitting, sipping a bottle of whiskey, whittling a piece of wood with his knife. She sat silently at the kitchen table, knitting booties for her baby, as little Mason lay asleep in a small bassinet next to her. Suddenly William stood up and abruptly announced, "I'm going out for a while." Ellen's eyes widened. She heard the tension in his voice. She put her knitting down and immediately stood up to face him. "No, you said that was it. No more going out, William." The tension began to turn to rage, the voice of rage William had known since he was a child, the voice that tormented him until he found a way to calm it. He walked over to her. "What do you mean, no? I am going out." Ellen pleaded. "You promised me, William. I will tell them." "You will what?" He gritted his teeth as his voice suddenly changed. "You will what now?" Ellen backed up, grabbed the baby, and ran into the bedroom. William set down the bottle of whiskey loudly on the table, gripped the knife, picked up a small piece of rope from beside the fireplace, and slowly walked toward the door. He paused, his conscience telling him no. Yet he felt his rage boiling and his eyes glowing red with heat. Destiny was screaming in his mind. He opened the door, Ellen was cowering, sitting on the bed, watching him as he stepped closer. She looked at the knife and the rope and quickly put the baby into the bassinet. "William, please, you don't have to." He grabbed her, and she began to plead with him. "No, William, please." The following morning, William sat quietly at the kitchen table, periodically looking through the slightly ajar door into the bedroom. He glanced down at little Mason, asleep in the bassinet next to him. Suddenly William stood, tormented, and began to pace the floor. Ellen was the only woman who ever truly loved him. He knew this now. He heard the door of the downstairs shop unlock and open. He looked at the clock. It was Mrs. Marjorie opening the store. Mrs. Marjorie walked across the floor to the back of the shop and suddenly slid, nearly falling. She caught herself and looked down. There was a puddle of something on the floor. She held the lamp, looking closer. Her eyes widened, just as a drop of blood fell onto her white sleeve. She looked up at the ceiling and gasped, and then ran out to find the police. 5 minutes later, a policeman blowing a whistle came running up the stairs. He kicked open the door and saw William sitting at the table with a blank look on his face. The policeman looked in the bedroom and immediately ordered William to lay flat on the floor. Within minutes, more police arrived. They cuffed William and hauled him to the Dundee prison. They then began the grim task of carrying Ellen's bloody body away. Mason was quietly taken away, too. The judge ordered that nothing of the child should be in the news, and the newspaper editor honored that request. Mrs. Marjorie asked for temporary custody of little Mason and was granted it. Within several weeks, the next of kin in England were contacted. Chapter 2. December 2016, Mesquite, Nevada. Stephen Paddock was ushered into the doctor's private office and waited, holding a small bag, not speaking. The doctor came in, sat down, and sighed. "Mr. Paddock, your blood work shows a high concentration of cancer cells." Stephen's eyes widened, and he felt his heart lurch. "What kind of cancer?" "I can't tell from the blood tests, but based on the exam we did and where your pain is coming from, there's a good chance it's pancreatic cancer." Stephen nodded. He already knew how serious pancreatic cancer was. He took a deep breath. "Tell me about that." "It's premature to diagnose it. You have to go in for more tests to know for sure, and to see what stage it might be at." Stephen shook his head. "Listen, Doctor, I'm not interested in any more tests. I just want you to tell me your best guess." The doctor took a deep breath. "Like I said, based on your pain, I'd probably guess that it's pancreatic cancer." Stephen nodded. "I don't want anything written down. I don't even want this visit or my last one on my record." Stephen opened the bag and reached in, pulling out a bank-bundled pack of bills. "Doctor, there's $1,000 in this bundle. There are 9 more bundles just like it in this bag. All I want you to do is tell me what to expect and erase my record of ever being here. You'll never hear from me again." Stephen held out the money. The doctor hesitated. "Mr. Paddock, I don't know if—" Stephen wouldn't let him finish. "Doc, this is simple. Take this cash, tell me what to expect, and get rid of my records. It's not hard. I accept what's happening to me." The doctor looked at him once more, then nodded, showing he agreed. He said, "If it's true that you have pancreatic cancer, you can expect a lot of pain. It looks to me that you may have 6 months to a year, but it could go faster, depending upon what stage it's at." Stephen stood up and looked at him sternly and asked,
Can I count on you to keep these past visits out of my record?"
The doctor nodded, and Stephen handed him the bag and quietly left. Stephen arrived home in a panic. He was suddenly out of time. Rosamie was at work, and he knew she wouldn't be back for several hours. He began cursing, walking through the house, throwing things, breaking things. His life would end before long, and Mary Jaycox would be right about him. He had to prove himself to his dad. He had to do something that would redeem his sad life. His rage began to boil, so he grabbed his half-full bottle of scotch, chugged what remained, and smashed it into the living room wall. Then he drove to his storage facility, turned on the light, and sat in his chair, weeping and staring at his massive gun collection until he finally fell asleep. August 2017, Cleveland, Ohio. Teresa May Connor pulled into the driveway and ran over to her mom, who was working in the front flower garden.
"Mom, I just got off the phone with Bree. She's getting engaged to Eric, and she asked me to be her maid of honor."
Marie took off her garden gloves and hugged her.
"Congratulations, honey."
They went into the house, where Mark was sitting on the couch reading the evening newspaper. Marie said,
"Mark, Teresa has some news."
He put down the paper. "What's the news?" Teresa proceeded to tell him the news, and Mark replied, "Well, that's wonderful news. When's the wedding?"
"In the spring. But I have even more news. David called me today. He wants Bree and me to visit, so we're flying out to see him in Vegas at the end of September."
"That's nice," said Mark. Teresa and David were the closest of his children, and he was always glad when they visited each other. Mark asked, "Does he have enough room for both of you?"
"Yeah, I just talked to him, and there's even more news. We're getting tickets to go see a country concert there."
"Who's playing?" Marie asked.
"My total favorites, Eric Church and Jason Aldean."
Mark smiled, shaking his head. "I should have known. A country concert."
"Well, of course, Dad. What other kind of concert is there?"
Mark shook his head with a wide smile on his face. "Well, have a good time, honey."
"Thanks, Dad."
April 24th, 1889, Dundee Prison. A crowd of nearly 300 people from as far away as London walked behind the condemned man. Some were crying, some trying to get his attention, but most were jeering, excited that Barry would now get justice. Even though William Barry had only confessed to killing Ellen, many had traveled from Whitechapel, believing he was guilty of much more. The dark angel Thaddeus stood on top of the prison building, looking down upon the gallows. His black wings glistened in the steady rain of the cold, cloudy day. William was his responsibility, and so far all was going according to plan. Just then an angel named David from the other side landed next to him. "Hello, Thaddeus. Will today be the day you join the other dark angels who are imprisoned in the cages?" Thaddeus smugly glanced over at him. "I doubt it." "Well, I don't. I'm going to get William to confess to it all and get him to ask the Lords for forgiveness. Once he does, it won't go well for you. You will face the wrath of the Lords." Thaddeus half smiled, shaking his head. "I've told you, you're wrong. They're only rumors because he lived there." David smiled. "We'll see, won't we?" David leaped into the air and flew down for his final chance to sway William Barry. Thaddeus watched him, and for a moment lamented he'd been assigned to this man. He had no control over the voice of the Dark Lord that drove men, especially men who bore the dark mark, to commit the most heinous of crimes. Deep down, though, Thaddeus wasn't too worried. He was 2 steps ahead of them all. Since he was hanging anyway, William wanted to confess to all the killings, but Thaddeus had convinced him not to, by promising William only a short stay in hell. It was a lie, of course, but that was what dark angels did. They lied. Still, there was a chance his plan could backfire. There was still time for it to all unravel. Thaddeus nervously flew closer, hovering over the crowd, watching his dejected client lumber along the final stretch of the muddy walkway. Thaddeus breathed a sigh of relief as William reached the gallows, paused to stare up, then resolutely climbed the 12 wide wooden stairs to the hanging platform. His time was running out. The angel David was hovering over William, pleading into his mind for him to confess and ask forgiveness. But William's angry face showed he would not. When William reached the top step, he turned to face the 4 men who stood waiting on the platform. These were men with official duties to make sure all was done in accordance with proper hanging procedure. 2 of them held William, while the other 2 fixed the noose around William's neck. They tightened it and asked if he had any final words. William stood silently, as all eyes were now fixed on him. He heard his conscience pleading with him to ask forgiveness. He was thinking it over as he looked out over the crowd, confused. But then his eyes locked on Thaddeus. Thaddeus was nodding, urging him on. William trusted Thaddeus, and he trusted the deal they had struck. He decided to make a show for the crowd and began to grin as if some unexpected joyful news had just arrived. He let out a sinister laugh and shouted, "Ha ha! No more the sun! Into the dark I go!" A deafening silence swept over the crowd, followed by murmuring. Many felt something demonic had just been uttered. The hangman did not wonder or ponder his meaning. He forcefully pulled the lever, surprising all in the tense moment. William's body dropped down, stopping with a horrendous thud. After several minutes of shuddering and twirling, all grew still. Thaddeus waited a moment, basking in the sense of satisfaction he felt. He had successfully guided a man with the dark mark into hell, without him being found guilty of all the heinous crimes some wished to label him with. Thaddeus smiled, then swooped down and drove a large hook into the back of William, lifting the dead man into the sky. "Wake up, William. It's time to go to hell." William woke in agony and began to scream. "Stop! It hurts!" "Oh, I know it hurts, William," Thaddeus laughed. William's eyes widened. "Wait! You said it will only be a short time, right?" "Yes, William, a short time it will be. Till we get there. Then it might seem like forever." Thaddeus started laughing as a look of horror came over William's face. 1 month later. A horse-drawn carriage pulled up to the courthouse. Mr. and Mrs. James Paddock, cousins of Ellen from England, climbed out and went inside. They were there to take custody of Mason. Mrs. Marjorie, who had been taking care of the child, was there waiting in an adjoining room with the bundled baby. She took the bottle of holy water from her pocket and put a drop on the baby's forehead one more time, tracing the sign of the cross and uttering the ancient prayer an old woman from the village had given her. Mrs. Marjorie had performed this ritual every day since the killing. She put the holy water back in her pocket and closed her eyes, knowing it would be the last time. After the Paddocks signed the papers, a door was opened, and Mrs. Marjorie brought the child in. She quietly handed the sleeping baby to Mrs. Paddock. Mrs. Marjorie then went back into the adjoining room and dragged in a small trunk of things that belonged to Ellen. She also handed them a large envelope. "What is this?" asked Mr. Paddock.
It's newspaper clippings from the trial, and some other things I found that I thought would be of interest to ye."
Mr. Paddock thanked her, but Mrs. Marjorie did not smile. It was as if she needed to tell him something more, something important.
"Mr. and Mrs. Paddock, I wanted—"
She stopped, knowing she might be labeled a loon.
"Never mind,"
she said. The Paddock family took Mason back to England, where they were preparing to immigrate to America. Mason would be going with them. Chapter 3. 1921, Sheboygan, Wisconsin. 33 years later. Mason Paddock looked through the hospital ward window at the cribs. There were 7 babies, but he was deep in contemplation with his eyes fixed on the 4th child. A little sign taped to the crib read, "Baby Boy Paddock." Mason felt the pride of new life. He was 33 years old, and his wife had just given them their first child. But he was worried. He hadn't had time for anything between working and getting to the hospital each night. It was their 3rd day there, and his wife and child would be coming home. He needed to get home. He needed to see the letter again. After signing the hospital discharge papers and loading his wife and child into his car, he drove toward home. As the sun set on the distant horizon, he couldn't help but feel hope for the future. His wife and newborn son Benjamin were coming home today. Mason had fought bravely in World War I and had earned numerous medals of distinction. A lieutenant in the Army, he regretted having sent 200 men to their deaths. They were serving the cause of freedom, the cause of America. Mason trusted that they all knew this when they raced up the ladders out of the trenches. Because of their sacrifice, America had come out the victor, and he was now home, enjoying the fruits of freedom. He vowed never to forget them. He pulled onto the gravel drive of their little bungalow that backed up to the Pigeon River. He helped his young wife and child upstairs and into bed. He and his wife talked a while, reading together in bed. After she fell asleep, he got out of bed and went down into his workshop. He turned on the light and pulled out a small wooden box he had kept hidden from his wife. It was his mother's. It was something she had always kept hidden. As a boy, he knew she kept it locked, so he never saw what was inside until after she died. He rifled through the clippings. He had seen them plenty of times over the past year. He paused to look again at the picture he now believed was his real father being led to the gallows. There was nothing more to see. He had studied it many times, looking for clues. But tonight he was looking for the letter. He had read it countless times, but now needed to reread it. He carefully unfolded the parched, worn-out paper. June 3rd, 1889, Dundee, Scotland. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Paddock, I've been wrestling with the idea as to whether I should tell you my opinion of what happened here last winter. Ellen was a beautiful woman, and so was her baby. But you see, it was the husband who was more than just a killer. He was evil, I tell ye. The local funeral man told me that William Barry indeed had the mark on his body, sure as day. I could never know this myself, but I do know of the darkness I saw in his eyes and in his soul. He came from Whitechapel, and from the day he arrived the infamous killings by Jack the Ripper in Whitechapel stopped. I believe he was Jack the Ripper. I'm almost certain of it. There's no proof, except I understand now what Ellen meant when she told me that she believed Jack the Ripper would be quiet now.
She didn't say it directly, but it was because she had gotten him out of Whitechapel. I believe with all my heart that poor Ellen knew who her husband was, and that is why he killed her. I took care of the baby for a month or so, and I bathed the little fellow lots of times. I'm sure he did not have the mark. But I talked to a local woman, steeped in the knowledge of the dark side. She told me in no uncertain terms that the mark of Cain can never be wiped off the earth, and she told me that dark lore held his race would always live on. And it is because of this I plead with ye to watch all children that may come from this little boy. Watch them, I tell ye, and if they have the mark, beware. I hesitate to say, but it may be better if they were never born at all. As God is my witness, Mrs. Marjorie.
Mason stared at the letter for a long while, thinking. He folded it and placed it inside the box. He pulled out the other letter, the one he kept behind it. It was not nearly as worn nor as old, but it was just as important. He unfolded it and began to read.
March 27th, 1908, Sheboygan, Wisconsin. My dear Mason, I know some day you will find this box with all these clippings and letters related to your real father. I decided I best write this in case something happens to me. Why did I keep the letter from Mrs. Marjorie all these years? It's because I want you to understand things for yourself, my boy, and make up your own mind. You have the right to know your bloodline. Things like this are never buried for good. I wanted you to hear it from your mother. Mrs. Marjorie was a crazy woman and not to be believed. From the moment I met her, I knew there was something off about her. Indeed, after reading her letter, I had correspondence with the chief constable in Dundee. His replies are included in this box. He, too, thought her mad. They say she committed suicide by throwing herself off a cliff into the sea. There were no witnesses, only that she told her friends she loved that place and would go there often. She was seen walking down the road alone toward the cliff the day she went missing for good. The constable told me that from the time your real mother Ellen was killed, Mrs. Marjorie was near daily at his door with her wild claims. Yes, it's true she was not the only one who believed it, but I think others merely grabbed on to her fantasies. I tried to find out who the local woman was that she referred to as steeped in matters of the dark side, but never could find her. I'll tell you now, this whole mark of Cain nonsense isn't true. I've watched you since you were a baby, and there's no mark of any kind upon you. Only the mark of a mother and father's love. It doesn't matter who your real parents were. It was your father and me who raised you and made you who you are today. With all my love, Mom.
Mason took a deep breath and sighed. He had doubts, but he needed to check Benjamin. Mason closed his eyes for a moment, then folded his mother's letter and went upstairs. He walked to the bassinet where his sleeping son lay. He stared for a while, looking, wondering, then picked him up. The boy woke up, fussing.
"Is he okay?"
the baby's mother asked. "Yes, go back to sleep. His diaper just needs changing. I'll do it." His wife nodded and gratefully fell back asleep. He took the boy downstairs and turned on the light in the living room. He laid him on a blanket on the floor and fetched a new diaper. He undressed him and carefully examined the front of his body. He turned the boy over, then froze. He got up and set the lamp on the floor There, on the back of the boy, just near the top of the hip, was a small, cloud-shaped mark. It was faint, but it was there. Mrs. Marjorie's words flashed through his mind.
It might be better if he were never born.
He objected to himself, out loud. No, 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 I won't. He looked again, confirming what he saw, then turned the boy over and smiled. Don't you worry, Benjamin. I'll be keeping you in line. There'll be no straying from the straight and narrow road for you. If it's the last thing I do, I'll make sure you become a model citizen.